I have a distinguished panel of contributors. Unfortunately, Comrade Dinga Sikwebu could not make it. He has a medical condition, but the comrade sent us his well wishes for the conference and for the 20 years of COPAC, and will be continuing his journey with us. In terms of our panel this morning, Gunnar Kaaf is a Marxist activist and writer based in Bloemfontein in the Free State. He's a long-standing political activist of 30 years. He's active in community organizations in the Free State as he simultaneously explores new left politics and alternatives. Devin Pillay is currently head of sociology at Wits University, a former political prisoner who was on Robben Island for many years. Devin was an activist in the UDF during the 1980s and with the ANC during the 1990s. He has worked for and in the labor movement as well as the independent media. His current interests include the challenges of counter-hegemonic politics, in particular the interface between eco-socialist and well-being happiness perspectives. Natalia Dinat grew up in exile, served on the ANC Youth Committee in London in her teens. In the 1980s, she was sent to study medicine in the Soviet Union. She was an elected youth delegate to the ANC Kabul conference. After the unbanning of the ANC, she returned to South Africa with the second youth repatriation group. She worked at the Chris Hani Baragwanath Hospital and Wits, whilst qualifying as a medical specialist. She became active in the women's health and HIV issues in her branch of the TAC and set up the first PMTCT clinic in the country in 1998. Later, she was elected by the women's sector to the high-level South African National AIDS Council. She continues to work with local community groups on health and environmental issues, working as a doctor and as a homeopath. Comrades, this is our panel for this morning, helping us think through this question on where to for the South African and global left. Who would like to go first?
Sure, go for it. Garnet and these stupid stuff and make you feel organized.
No, I'll manage.
Amanda, go to.
Hey, wait.
Yep.
I'm going to make 5 key points in thinking about the left renewal in South Africa in this era of global capitalist crisis. The first point is crisis. The second point is the post-1994 South African social formation. The third point is a new vision for the left. The fourth point is a new strategy for the left. The last point would be mass movements.
There you go.
So we start with the first point, crisis. The starting point is that we talk about rebuilding the left, renewing the left in a context of an era of a crisis. We have a crisis in South Africa that is deepening, the worst crisis since 1994. A political crisis marked by poor governance, corruption, and the lack of a development strategy. An economic crisis of stagnation, mass unemployment, and widespread poverty. You include inequality. It is a crisis of neoliberal policies that are worsening the living conditions of the majority of South Africans who live in urban and rural areas. So it's a crisis of maldevelopment. It's also an ecological crisis in which natural resources get depleted in a manner that threatens human survival. and in which climate change is also changing in ways that are really threatening. So that's the context in which we need to be thinking about the left. But again, if you think globally as well, it's an era of a deepening global capitalist crisis that got worse in 2007 with the financial global crisis. It's an accumulation crisis. It actually starts in the 70s when the second post-World War boom got exhausted. And instead of finding new outlets of investment, outlets of growing the capitalist economy, capitalism then tended to globalize, financialize, and push industrial production to the south, particularly in China. Now, what we saw happening in 2007 was a crisis of the financial sector that was bursting out because too much reliance had been on the financial sector. So the accumulation crisis that was never resolved in the 70s remains with the capitalist economy. They can't find new outlets for new investment and for expanding production. So it's a crisis economically that is so deep that even both mainstream and heterodox economists agree that it is a depression. And there's no way out. Not even the fourth industrial revolution is creating outlets for new investment of surplus capital that comes from the overproduction. Now, another important area of this crisis in South Africa is the ANC crisis. The ANC crisis is important because for the longest time, the ANC has dominated our politics. Now, the left has to think carefully in how it frames its critique against the ANC crisis. The ANC crisis is basically driven by two fundamental factors. One is lack of meaningful social transformation since 1994. That reality of lack of social transformation means that the rhetoric of a better life for all has ran its day because it has not manifested in reality. For the majority of South Africans, in many respects, life has gotten worse. So there's been no better life. But again, it's a crisis that comes from the corruption of the ANC, the rot, the looting of the state. So, here are two things that I want that the left should guard against in analyzing the in analyzing the ANC crisis. One, we should avoid the betrayal thesis that the left has been simply, or the people have been simply been betrayed by the ANC. Yes, there are elements of betrayal, but it's not wholly about betrayal. It's not wholly about betrayal because what the betrayal thesis does is to ignore the fact that the ANC political strategy, the National Democratic Revolution, was always limited because it did not pose a sufficient social transformation dimension that is anti-capitalist. There was no way that the ANC would succeed in posing a better social transformation that would lift the living conditions of the majority without tackling and questioning the South African capitalism as it has unfolded. So in many respects, when the ANC did the bourgeois capitulation, adopted neoliberalism, it allowed capital to restructure in its own terms to globalize further and to financialize. So that's why we saw many South African corporations, big corporations, going offshore in the 90s. And again, their neoliberalism, they thought that it would result to inflows of huge capitals into productive sectors that would create jobs and therefore a better life for majority. That didn't happen. Instead, we saw the financial sector expanding further and further as a proportion of the GDP, and how it dominated the economy. So that's why the betrayal thesis it's limited. It's because it's not nuanced enough to understand the weaknesses in the NDR itself. Now, the second one is the old leftist sterile critique, mainly from the Trotskyites and other leftist groups from the outside the ANC left, to say the ANC has always been a bourgeois party. It was therefore bound to capitulate and become a full-blown comprador party. That critique is also not helpful because it fails to understand the social base that the ANC had as it went to 1994 and how the ANC used that social base to challenge the ruling class in South Africa. And for a while, the ruling class was threatened, by the victory of the ANC in 1994. But then, dialectically, the ANC, because it did not have an anti-capitalist strategy, just succumbed, to a ruling class that was already threatened by it. So, I go to my next point. The South African social formation post-1994. Now, this crisis and these neoliberal policies, the capitulation of the ANC, and how ANC has presided over the post-1994 South Africa, has led to a particular social formation that is marked by certain key features. What are those features? We need to understand them clearly as the left. One of those features is that cheap labor was allowed to continue. Cheap labor was a key accumulation system of South African historical capitalism. It was allowed to continue. It was not altered, it was not tampered with. Instead, because other industries that used to subsidize cheap labor, such as the rural economy, had declined completely. So the state created new subsidies for the cheap labor, EPWP, social grants, and so on. So cheap labor continued, and it's big in how we need to understand the South African capitalism and how it is restructured after 1994. And so Marikana was that moment where the ANC, where the cheap labor was called into question. But again, capital was allowed to restructure in its own terms, as I already said. And so what it sought to do was to co-opt the black middle class. The black middle class expanded, and so because mass movements had been destroyed, the black middle class became the main political representatives of the system that has been used to govern after 1994. And in many ways, the disappointment, the lack of services from government, the lack of development, stagnation in the lives of the people, all of that sort of impaired the popular classes to resist and to even pose a challenge to the post-1994 capitalism. And those weaknesses as well had to do with the fact that mass movements gotten weak from the 90s coming this way. There were attempts to revive them, but they didn't go any far. Now, thinking about the left, the new vision for the left, I'll just summarize. My time is getting up already. Clearly, when we think about the left, we can't just think of, we have to think of two great categories. One is a category of those who are trying to challenge capitalism and replace it with a new system, socialism. So those will be communists and socialists of various kinds. But also there are others on the left who pose the demands of popular classes, you know, and in that way they still challenge capitalism, South African capitalism, but they don't want to go far into the future to want to replace it. So those would be sometimes, comrades from the National Liberation Movement, various strands of feminists, environmentalists, other community activists and organizations, youth activists are found there as well. And again, this vision that we need to think about for building a socialism, we should abandon the old communist model of trying to capture the state first and then build socialism. That's not going to happen. Instead, we should rather try to move progressively, incrementally, to build people's power in ways that challenge capital and attempt to pose a better transformation agenda. So the left strategy as well, it should be based on the unity and the diversity of the left, acknowledging that the left has many others, has many strengths within it. So there should be, diversity should be encouraged instead of being discouraged. At the same time, there should be an attempt to forge unity. And here in my paper, I make an example of how Karl Marx, in the First International, was the main drafter of speeches and resolutions. He didn't come in there to smuggle in the Communist Manifesto they had written with angels. Instead, he recognized the anarchists, you know, followers of Bakunin, the followers of Proton in France, the followers of Liesel in Germany, the Chartists and conservative trade unions from England. He recognized those as the main currencies of the left in Europe at the time. And in formulating resolutions and speeches and policies for the First International, he sought to integrate all of them and instead discard illusions and weaknesses, ideological weaknesses in each of those. And so that's how the unity in the First International was forged. But then that was kicked out in the Third International, where it was said, no, one country, one communist party. So, whereas initially it was acknowledged that in countries you have many left traditions, that should be allowed. So the one country, one communist party sought to, of the Third International, sought to say there has to be a line for the left. And if you don't follow that line, then you're not one of us. So that's why unity and diversity are important. Lastly, mass movements should be a nucleus for any left strategy we think about. It's easy to meet here as clever leftists and form a left party and draft a socialistic manifesto and hold a media conference and have Vish and Jaha and other left luminaries there and say, no, the left is back, you know, just declare. It's easy to do that, but it will not connect with the people. So what we need to do is to go on the ground, build organizations on the basis of the social demands of the popular classes. demand better living conditions of our people in rural areas and in townships, hold government accountable, counter the power of corporates in various areas, in various communities. So at the back of that people's power, then launch political alternatives that seek to build an eco-socialist alternative. Let me leave it there, we shall
Alright, who's next? Thank you. Seven.
Thanks. Thanks, Comrade Garnett. I'm glad you said everything you said, so I don't have to say it. Because now I can talk about something else. Something completely different. Well, not that different. The issue of the future of the left suggests many things, but in many of our minds we have this traditional understanding, the discussion between anarchists and Marxists and Marxist-Leninists and social democrats, etc., what is left. And we can get bogged down in that. Although I think we've reached a point in history where we're looking for something different, but not too different. I still identify myself as a Marxist, an ecological Marxist, a humanist, an ecologically informed humanist, maybe, because I know humanism has its own pitfalls. Could suggest that you are not interested in other animals and nature in general. Now, what happened last week, and over the past year in particular, but came to a head last week around the climate strike, brought many things to the fore, I think. It's a kind of a breakthrough in the world after many, many decades of ignoring the climate crisis. Now, I do acknowledge the very valid points made yesterday that it's not just about the climate. And I've always thought of the climate crisis as using the word climate change as a proxy for a host of environmental challenges that we face. Because I follow social media, and I know Michelle thinks it's a waste of time. But you learn a lot from social media. And one of the issues that come up, people say, no, there's no climate crisis, but there's definitely a plastics crisis. And we must focus on the plastics crisis. So people do, generally speaking, ordinary folks are, they're not us lefties, recognize there's a problem. We've got one of the bigger environmental mobilizations last week that I've known of in this country for a long time. We had the unions come on board, some unions in SAFTU, which is a major breakthrough. So there's an opening. And this is the moment, I think, that we've reached globally and in South Africa that we can build on. I remember a discussion I had with Jeremy Cronin. Sorry, I can't speak and hold this mic. About 12 years ago at one of the SARTU Congress. And he said, no, I agree with you that there's an ecological crisis, but I can't talk about it in the party because people are not interested. But my point then, and I think not just myself, of course, but others around the world in the environmental movement and the ecological Marxist movement, that the environmental crisis is what could bind together a counter-hegemonic alliance. Linking social issues and environmental issues into a potent, powerful counter-hegemonic force. Of course, the traditional left, which we all come out of, most of us, never made those connections and tended to want to operate within their own pure sects, which never got us very far. And I was engaged again on Facebook with a traditional Marxist-Leninists who were saying, you know, what is this a liberal thing? Look, and he posted Hillary Clinton supporting Greta Thunberg, just shows the neoliberal plot, right? And that's such a misreading of the moment. In my understanding, it's the left from the ecological movement, etc., that have been pushing this issue. Someone like Greta Thunberg, this young, remarkable young teenager, she's been reading, you know, people like Naomi Klein and others who have been inspirational to her. Okay, maybe someone will say she's a liberal left, I don't know. You know, if you come from a hardcore Marxist-Leninist, everybody is liberal. And I'm very cautious about this, using this word liberal. It's such a misused word. You know, we use it, and you use it, I use it sometimes, and I think we should be very careful. Oh, that's liberal. This is a proper way to do things. And liberal in this country, in America, liberal means to be a socialist. In this country, liberal means to be a white, evil person that wants to mislead you down some horrible pathway. Let's be cautious about how we use these terms. If you want to build, if you're serious about building a counter-hegemonic movement. And this gathering, I'm very inspired by what Vish has been doing, and the, you know, it's not just about intellectual discourse, but you guys are doing things, you're building something as well as trying to engage with the broader world. And that's a good approach. And so what does it mean to be on the left? So I want to adopt as broad a definition as possible. It's about a humanist approach, connecting ourselves as human beings. But there are certain universal values which are all latent within us that we can ignite, about non-racialism, but of course around the identification of the fundamental nature of class oppression. And I really want us to be careful, and that's a discussion we were having yesterday in one of the panels, and we will continue to have, careful about getting into the game of victim Olympics, or who is the most oppression Olympics, who is the most oppressed, whether it's women, whether it's Africa, whether it's black people, whether it's Native Americans, etc. Because that really gets us into a negative space. Building a positive connection between people, I believe, is a left project. And how do we enhance what is valuable to us in order to build something new? Now, the negativity in this country over the past few years, racialized discourses, yes, we can identify that there's such a thing as white privilege, but there are lots of other privileges. There's male privilege, there's heterosexual privilege, there's the able people's privilege. So, when we hook into one dimension of privilege and we demonize the people who are meant to be carrying it, we have an over-racialized, an over-identitarian, narrow identitarian politics, which we need to break out of. You're centralizing difference instead of seeking the common. Now, I'm going to talk about something that is not generally talked about in left circles, but there's something interesting happening on Facebook. I'm sure none of you have heard of it because you're probably not on Facebook. But there's a new group, now because of all this negativity in the country, a lot of people are on edge, right? Not just white people, middle class people, wanting to leave the country. Then someone said, I'm going to form this group called I'm Staying. And all of a sudden, with a matter of weeks, got 250,000 members. And they just focus on positive connecting stories. Now, you might say it's a liberal thing, right? I'm sure someone like Julian Scritter, these bloody stupid liberals, leave them. They're not focusing on the real issues of negative moaning and complaining. Now, I'm sure we do need to critique. As Marxists, as sociologists, that's what we do, we critique. But it's also so refreshing. I go there every morning and you have this positive glow because your stories are how people connect in the real world, how they help each other across racial lines, across gender lines, etc. real everyday people, something that you intuitively know about, and you understand and interact with people. And that not all white people are these racist AfriForum members, right? And not all black people want to kill white people. Real connecting stories. Now, it's not left in the traditional sense, but that's a platform to build on. That's a raw material to build on, I believe, right? If we can get 250,000 people with our lefty site in 3 weeks, that would be fantastic. But you know, this is something interesting. And for me, it's the same phenomenon as the Greta Thunberg phenomenon. Something that ignites masses of school kids and beyond, as Vish reminded us, workers, etc. But yesterday was another massive, massive demo. I don't know if it came in the traditional media, but because I'm on Twitter, I get all the feeds. I have a direct line to Greta Thunberg. And it's these huge outpourings around the world, which are so encouraging. And I've written something recently, this is a journal called Globalization, so I don't know how ordinary people outside the university can access it, but nevertheless, because the publishing world is a tyranny. You've got to pay huge amounts of money, you're not connected to the university, to get into a journal. But I'm trying to, so this humanist perspective, try to interrogate recent debates and discourses. There's the one school of thought around happiness and well-being, and this is from Bhutan, which I visited a few years ago and did some research there. And it's a predominantly Buddhist country, so the happiness principle is a rise out of Buddhist thinking, but it's not confined to Buddhist thinking. I mean, the American Constitution has happiness in it. Aristotle promoted the idea of happiness, etc., the pursuit of happiness. And so there's that body of thinking around well-being, not GDP growth, but gross national happiness, counterposing growth to happiness, not necessarily excluding the phenomenon of economic growth, but saying that growth needs to be subordinated to societal well-being. And then you have this eco-socialist perspective, also having a strong critique of economic growth, coming out of Michael Lowy, he's a Trotskyist, others come from other anarchist perspectives coming to that, etc. Ecological Marxism, all part of that growing body of thinking. And looking at Michael Lowy's work, I saw no mention of happiness perspectives or well-being. Looking at the well-being perspectives, I see no mention of eco-socialism. And I just think that's a problem. It's a problem of we are erecting these Chinese walls, as Joe Slow used to say. These Chinese walls between discourses and what I believe people saying, trying to address similar problems, but having different nuances of pointing to different types of solutions. But there's no effective communication. No respectful communication. Now, of course, there are some fundamental issues about the human condition that intercedes. The ego, some might say the male ego, and a lot of these movements are led by men. But I don't want to over-essentialize the biology, and Michelle must listen to this. I don't want to over-essentialize the biology factor, although I do think macho male politics is a problem on the left. But if I think of my own sociology department, the men sit quietly and the women dominate. So ego may not be confined to men only, but it is predominantly. And it's this ego-driven politics. If we don't look at, so what the happiness perspective, or what a Buddhist type, although I use Buddhist as a proxy for a whole range of religious perspectives that have a common core, value, which is about compassion, that competes with patriarchal and other hierarchical and oppressive doctrines within a religious movement. But compassion, for me, is essentially a socialist idea, concept. And using compassion, it drives us to look into ourselves. So it's about the inner and the outer transformation. If we don't do both, any politics we try to replicate, any movement we try to create, it's going to be ego-driven, ultimately. And then, not necessarily useless, because you do have parties in the last century, like the Labour Party in Sweden, that built something, a good welfare state. So not all parties that are led by men are necessarily leading to complete blind alleys, but that is a limitation. So this is the challenge of the left, and how to build a counter-hegemonic strategy, a different type of politics. I don't personally rule out parties. I don't even necessarily rule out the idea of a vanguard, because a vanguard is different to a vanguardist. And the Communist Party of Kerala is one idea of a vanguard type party that doesn't have to be vanguardist. I've got 0 time left and I've covered everything. So, a flexible politics, flexible strategies and tactics. Yesterday we touched on what do we do with Barbara Creasy, who is sympathetic and raises issues in Parliament. Should we say she's an enemy, or how do we engage with people in government and still maintain a strategic perspective that doesn't lock you into government processes? So those are challenges for any new type of movement. But I'm hopeful. And when I read these things in the morning from this I'm Staying site, I feel so good about this country. And you should all get onto that site. Thank you.
Viva!
Devin, when women lead, it doesn't mean they're egomaniacs. But anyway, let's hand over to Natalia.
But Michelle knows who
Let's focus.
Jane? So, my talk, Where to for the Left in South Africa, the talk outline. So I'm going to look at a contemporary, the importance of a contemporary Marxist analysis, very briefly. Is it time for a broad left front? Some current bones of contention and lessons from history, and towards an ideology and program for the left. Just some thoughts on that. So contemporary Marxist thought gives us a powerful understanding of why we are where we are today, as well as tools to change things for the better. In South Africa, some left thought has often been characterized by ahistoric analysis or nostalgic analysis, and the mechanical application or lazy and unimaginative models of dialectical materialism and static models of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis are really unhelpful. So I found Samira Amin's contemporary Marxism very, very helpful. The global capitalist forces are changing rapidly, and we build this ship as we sail as Marxists. So my children said I must use lots of memes. Here's the one. The year is 2259, and Earth is a member of the United Federation of Planets, minus the United Kingdom, which is still trying to leave the EU. So talking about Chris's global, this is not the ship that we're building as we sail, but as we move towards a global people's movement, we need to build a national one. And there is no blueprint. Rosa Luxemburg said that the modern proletariat class does not carry out its struggle according to some plan that's set out in a book or in a theory. So we do actually build this ship as we sail. So in 2015, I started a discussion group called the Baobab Group amongst activists from Lenasia. The purpose of the group, Devin, was to encourage dissent, articulation of varying opinions, diversity of opinions without killing each other. It was a very interesting experience. Then in 2017, I started the Future of the Left discussion group, and some of you have attended that. This group was attended by quite traumatized and wounded ex-members of the SACP. The first session was very, very, I think, traumatic for people. Comrades from various hues of the left and the South African members of the South African Communist Party. The South African Communist Party were part of, but not leading this group. And they weren't the vanguard in this group, but they listened and they participated and were quite interesting. So this is me, the old Russian lady at the bottom, with Stalin, Победа будет за нами, victory is ours. And this is some of the sort of hue of people that we had. This group made a call for a broad left front, and I shall share some of its thinking. So the Future of the Left discussion group saw the need for preliminary discussions with trade union federations and a broad section of civil society towards a broad left front. There were many ideas about what this looked like. In addition to this, on separate occasions, Ronnie Casrels, Carl Kluter, Ben Turok, many of you within the room have called for the formation of a broad left front as a move forward. We need to ask, is it time? For what purpose is this front, and for what aims, and how should we do it? And how broad should we go? In South Africa, the 99%, because we're the most unequal nation, or second most unequal nation on earth, encompasses a very wide range from sort of national bourgeoisie to the poorest of the poor. We need to ask questions like, who do we ally with on the climate change, or planet, as David was saying yesterday, journey for, to save this planet? Does this then make Barbara Creasy the enemy when we talk about broad terms? Can we engage and hold her department accountable? Can we use the Constitution of South Africa, as well as have adversarial postures? What kind of unity do we need, and with who? We need to unpack deep alliances. Who do we have deep, long-lasting alliances with? Who do we have strategic alliances with? Who do we have tactical alliances with? Do we need a front? Do we need an alliance? In Portugal, it's been written by Santi that reproducing Portugal's successful model formula, it won't be easy, because the willingness of the radical parties in Portugal to work with the moderates is not the case in many other countries. And in South Africa, can we encompass plurality in Marxist and socialist thought without splitting? So this is one of my favourite, being a doctor. Feeling sad and depressed? Are you anxious, worried about the future? You may be suffering from capitalism. So this is my medical one. So I like Ben Turok's writing on the tasks of the broad left and the broad left front. And he wrote that our tasks are to win the argument, to conscientize people, to have a forum to discuss the development of a program. We're lacking a program as the left. To have workers' night schools, to be with or in small mass movements, to unite the masses, for example, in mining and environment, the Cape Farm workers, in women, health, land and safety, and to expose the dirty tricks of capitalism, of xenophobia, racism, and gender discrimination. So this is a clip from Monty Python's Life of Brian, which I think talks to South African left politics. Splitters. That's the argument between the People's Front of Judea and the Popular People's Front. So I really like this quote. This is James Baldwin. We can disagree and still love each other, unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and right to exist. And I think the key to being able to love each other is a political consciousness and a class awareness. Thus, I would argue that the first task and the continuous task is education. It may be workers and people's schools for literacy, for financial literacy, for food literacy, for health literacy and political literacy. It is very doable. We can take over the airways on community radios. We may chat on buses and use social media, etc. So one of the arguments about vanguardism or dialectics of spontaneity and organization, Rosa Luxemburg, her position was colored by the reality of the German movement. While Lenin stressed ultra-centralism, Rosa Luxemburg stressed democracy and organizational flexibility. Where Lenin emphasized a dominant role of the professional revolutionists, Luxemburg countered the emphasis on the mass movement and its elemental upsurge. Why was this? Because these various forces clearly played different roles in Russia and Germany. So there is not a one-size-fits-all situation. In Germany, the professionals were careerist, conservative trade union bureaucrats. They acted as a brake upon the class action of workers and not as a spur. The situation was different in Russia. The movement was loose and ineffectual, based on circles, as Lenin said, almost always resting on personal friendships. In Germany, the movement was tightly organized, conservatively disciplined and routinized, and dominated by a semi-reformist centralist leadership. These circumstances led Luxemburg to the view that only an appeal to the masses could break through this. The centralism of Lenin forged a party that were able to lead to the Russian masses to a victorious revolution. So what I'm saying in this is South Africa's situation today may not be South Africa's situation 20 years ago or anywhere else in the world, and we need to apply this quite with thought. So this is thank you to Lindsay Lewis, and here she is showing us with her decolonized t-shirt that she made. She's showing us, is Lindsay here?
She left.
She was here.
She was here. How to link struggles. So as Hamid and Mark said on Friday, they were concerned that there's no bridge between the masses and the massive struggle and the large global questions and the large theoretical analyses. I would suggest that that bridge is an ideology. We are lacking an ideology in the left. Okay, I'll just jump over this bit. In our Future of the Left discussion group, we came up with the suggestion of a program because we are also lacking a program. One that unites people around a rallying cry in their around their daily lives. One was to defend the Constitution. We were talking about this at the height of the Zuma issue, and to heighten the fight against corruption, was to move towards a proper sustainable economy, food security, land tax right, nationalisation of water, rail and energy, education, and the environment. And then lastly was internationalism. Martha Hanecker has also told us that we should use political instruments. Thank you. I'll go very fast. And that includes party plus the masses. We need to be flexible. She also noted, though, that fighting in the streets wasn't enough. We do, as a left, need a program. We need an analysis how to fight the enemy. Some of the tactics of the ruling class, they could buy, co-opt, maim, poison, bully, murder, use extreme violence, use social media and misinformation. They keep us down with consumerism, fear and debt and shock tactics, with nationalism, with rigging elections and attacking democratic institutions and dividing and ruling. Lastly, the point I want to make is that South Africa has long had a pervasive and, I think, detrimental attitude of exceptionalism. It came out in left thought, where we were colonialism of a special type, different to all the rest of Africa. We really never saw our struggle as an African struggle. With the SWAPO comrades, they would refer and talk to Kwame Nkrumah, about Julius Nyerere. South Africans, we were like different. And I think this causes a problem for us in the left. And I would argue that Samir Amin and his colleagues' work on the core semi-peripheries and peripheries are very helpful for analysis here, because it puts South Africa as a semi-periphery and it takes us away from this exceptionalism and it gives us tools for good international solidarity. And therefore we avoid missteps, making international solidarity easier and more natural. So to finish off, I've only got one slide on globalism, global left, but can you name anyone who can beat Captain America?
Superman.
Captain Vietnam. To a broad left front, comrades.